All right, so we're going to continue to march forward in our final unit of the year. It's all about evolution and organisms. And we're going to transition into the idea of classification, or in other words, how do scientists organize all the types of living things that are on the planet? And you guys know from this whole year, science is big on organization. Right? We've had different levels of organization depending on what our unit was. In ecology, talked about really large things like populations and ecosystems, and then other times we talked about very small things, right, like molecules, which go together to form, larger molecules, which go together to form cells, and those sort of concepts. So today what we're looking at is how do we organize all the different types of life, right? And Darwin really helped us to focus on the fact that most of us or all of us are related in some way on our planet, right? All the different forms of life. But what I often think of is that the diversity on our planet is a lot easier to observe than the unity on our planet, right? And if you think about it, I'm just being totally silly here in these pictures though. Like if we did a little thought experiment for a moment and you compare yourself to a spider, compare yourself to a squirrel, compare yourself to a blade of grass, I'm going to bet that you're going to more easily come up with ways that you are different than this spider or this blade of grass than ways that you are the same. And realize that there are similarities. In fact, there's at least 8 similarities, right, with every type of living thing as we've been looking at this whole school year. But there's also a lot of diversity. And so when we look at both the connections, the unity, and the diversity of living things, we seek to classify them or sort of categorize them into various groups. Now, we had this word on our little vocab primer a couple of weeks ago, and that was taxonomy. And so don't let it throw you off. It's not anything about taxes or taxation. Taxonomy is the area of science or the area of biology where scientists attempt to classify organisms, and also where scientists give us a universally accepted scientific name for all organisms. Now, we've sought to do this for literally hundreds of years now. Scientists realized, as we'll talk about here in a minute, a couple hundred years ago, that having an organized classification system allows scientists to collaborate or work together a lot more easily because it helps avoid confusion, right? If we are all speaking different languages, but we do have a universally accepted name for an organism, that won't be lost in translation, right? Now, the other thing that a classification system allows us to do is what we were just talking about on the last slide, which is to appreciate differences between organisms, but also logically group them together based on similarities that they have as well. So classification systems are typically hierarchical. We'll come back to that term here in a second. And they involve several groupings, right? The larger groups in a classification system are more general and include more individuals, or they're more inclusive. Then we break it down to successively smaller groups, which become smaller, more specific, and have fewer individuals, meaning that they are more exclusive, right? So this picture of a teacher who actually no longer works at Mercy, but in a Mercy classroom that used to be on our website here, classification systems, we use them constantly. We don't even realize we're doing it usually, but we organize things constantly. For instance, we can classify all of you guys in a lot of different ways too. But if you think about what I wrote down here, which is a little bit silly, but still, largest classification grouping we can drop you in is humans, right? Homo sapiens. But then we can say, hey, you guys are humans who are female, which is, about half the number, size of the human group. You are a female of a particular race or ethnicity, which is going to break you off into a smaller group. You are a human female of that particular ethnicity who lives in Louisville, Kentucky. Now we've hemmed you down to a much smaller group, right? But we can do even better. We can say you're one of those individuals and you are a high school student in Louisville, Kentucky. Now we've gotten that number down pretty small, but we can keep going. Right? You go to high school at Mercy Academy. Now we've narrowed that number down to what? Roughly 500 people, right? And at least for most of you guys, you are a freshman at Mercy Academy. Now we've narrowed that down to closer to 100 people, right? And we can go even further, right? You're a freshman who has advanced biology at a particular block, and now we've narrowed you down to a group of just 19 individuals. Right, so if we classify, we can just keep going into these successively smaller and smaller groups until hopefully we eventually get to the smallest thing we can, which is the most specific thing. And so if we were to follow this classification scheme all the way down, eventually we would just get to you, right? And there's no other like you, so you would occupy your own group. Now, the first and, well, probably not the first, but definitely the most famous taxonomist is a man named Carolus Linnaeus. Now, Carolus Linnaeus is a fun story, sort of. This guy's name is actually Carl von Linné, but he was obsessed with Latin, right? Which, as we'll talk about in just a moment, actually turned out to be a really good thing. But this guy named Carl, right, was so sure that really academic endeavors needed to be done in Latin that he brought that into his science. And Linnaeus, so he Latinized his name, right? He wrote under the name Carolus Linnaeus. But Linnaeus was working back in the 1700s, and he was way ahead of the curve. There are actually a lot of different things that are attributed to Linnaeus. He was one of the first people to suggest a carrying capacity for humans on the planet, which, by the way, we haven't met yet, but who knows. But a lot of different things. And what Linnaeus is most well known for is his system of classification that he derived in the mid 1700s that we still actually use today. And Linnaeus created a system in which he grouped organisms based on what he called homologies. Now, these are not exactly homologous characteristics like we learned in the previous chapter, because remember, this is the 1700s. They had no idea of genetics, right, and genetic relatedness. So for Linnaeus, homologies were just similarities in structure. Right? Now, what this did is it led to some classification designations that weren't real good, right? He grouped anything that had wings, close together, so like birds, bats, insects. And today we know that those are not really closely related organisms. A bat's much more closely related to you than it is birds or insects. And insects, of course, are a very different group. But it provided an awesome start. And Linnaeus came up with a hierarchical system, right, a classification system that had 7 different levels, or what we call taxa, would be the plural, or taxon is the singular for that. Now, from smallest to largest, the Linnaean system, shapes up like you see right here. The smallest, most specific grouping is well named. You have the species, right? Hence specific. A little bit larger group would be the genus. All right, a little bit larger down this chain. So we go species, genus, family, order, class, phylum, and kingdom would be the largest thing. And again, each of these is called a taxon, or the taxa. Generally we have one specific type of organism that is a species, and then we include more organisms as the groups get bigger or more inclusive, right? So this grizzly bear would be its own species. In fact, it's called Ursus arctos. And then this polar bear would be a different species. And I won't tell you that one's scientific name just yet, but I know some of you are like, wait a second, arctos sure sounds like a polar bear. But it's not. So we'll come back to that in just a second. So here's a systematic kind of illustration that comes from your textbook. And actually this picture, I feel like this particular picture has been around for a long time. But this is a little breakdown of the classification of a grizzly bear. All right, which this also is a little bit lightly colored to me to be a grizzly bear, but a grizzly bear. Now, as we mentioned, grizzly bear's scientific name, and we'll talk more about those in a moment, is Ursus arctos. But what I want to do is I want to start at the top, right? So if we start at the top, we have this kingdom, and this is the most inclusive group, the biggest group, right? And the grizzly bear belongs to the animal kingdom. Now, again, remember that Linnaeus was really into Latin, so we typically use are the Latin terminologies for these groupings. So the animal kingdom technically is referred to as Animalia, and that might include not only grizzly bears, but other kinds of bears as well, right? Black bears, giant pandas, um, polar bears, whatever. But then some other things, right? Foxes, squirrels, snakes, sea stars, anything that's an animal, right? The insects would be in here too, would be in this animal kingdom. But if we go to the phylum level, we narrow that down a little bit, right? And the phylum for grizzly bears is called Chordata, the chordates. Now, sometimes people confuse this with vertebrates. Vertebrates have a backbone. That's a later on thing. Chordates, you can kind of think of it, they have a spinal cord, right? They have a nerve cord in their body. And so with that, we can eliminate the sea star, right? Because sea stars don't have one of these type spinal cord type things. But it would still include this phylum Chordata would still include all these other organisms. Now, if we go down to a little bit more exclusive grouping, their class is called Mammalia. This is where we would be too, right? The mammals. And so that allows us to remove the snake from the grouping, but keep the squirrel, fox, and the different types of bears. Now we can go a little bit tighter, right? The order Carnivora, the carnivores. This is where we would fall out of this, right? But also the squirrels would. It's a good thing. Squirrels aren't carnivores. There's a whole bunch of them outside my house right now, and I don't want them trying to eat my face off or anything. But the carnivores, the meat eaters, right, would still include these bears and the fox. Now we can go a little bit smaller, and we'll look at the family Ursidae. Right, Ursidae, now we're getting Latin here for bears. This removes the fox, maintains these different bear types. Then we go to the genus. Now the genus is quite specific, right? And the genus, you can almost kind of think of this more like somebody's last name, right? Like there might be lots of Burtons out there, but it doesn't mean that we're that specific yet, right? And so this would be the more specific bears. So grizzly bears, black bears, polar bears would still be in this group too, are in the genus Ursus, but the panda bear is not. And then, last but not least, the most specific thing would be the species, and that is this grizzly bear. So what's up with this Ursus arctos thing, right? Part of classifying organisms is to establish the scientific name. Now, before Linnaeus's system came to be, and still today, we have what are called common names, right? So it's like what you would call an animal that you look at. So, oh yeah, that's a turtle, or that's a frog. But there's a whole bunch of different types of turtle, right? And a whole bunch of different types of frog. And so if you're a research scientist, you don't want to just say frog, right? We want to know exactly what kind of frog are you experimenting on. Now, we can go beyond that though too, right? There are also issues with language barriers and even with regional barriers. And so this picture right here, right? The common name of this big cat differs depending on where you are, not only on the planet, but in our country, right? This big cat could be called a cougar, might be called a puma, might be called a panther, might be called a mountain lion, depending on where you are in the United States. So if you've got a researcher on one coast talking about the cougars that he is researching, and a scientist on the other coast talking about the panthers that he is researching, they might think they're talking about totally different animals when they're talking about the same thing. So what Linnaeus derived was a system that, you guessed it, would use Latin to assign a scientific name to every specific organism, every species. And that way, when scientists communicated, whether they were talking even in different languages, they would be using the same name for the same type of organism, and there wouldn't be confusion about that. Now, the way we do this is called binomial nomenclature, which sounds like a mouthful, but binomial just means to name, and nomenclature just means naming system. All right, so it's a two-name naming system, or a two-name system of naming, technically. Now, again, this comes from the Linnaean classification system. It uses Latin. And the way we do this is we write an organism's genus followed by its species. And so we've got these bears that we saw before here. We've mentioned a couple times already that the grizzly bear is referred to as Ursus arctos. So it comes from the genus Ursus, as we saw on that previous slide, and it has the species terminology arctos. Then the polar bear, which I held out earlier, is called Ursus maritimus. Anybody figure out what's going on there? Yeah, so the grizzly bears were discovered in the north, right? Northern United States into Canada, also over in Siberia, Russia kind of area. These were kind of discovered first before polar bears, and scientists were like, wow, these things are from where it's cold, and so they called it Ursus arctos. Now then they found even more north polar bears. And so you couldn't go back then, right, and say, well, wait, these are going to be arctos. So what they did is they named them Ursus maritimus because polar bears were first described by sailors, and maritime usually references the ocean, right, or sailing. Now, there are two really important rules for binomial nomenclature, and these are so important, I put a hottie on the slide so you definitely remember it, right? These are the rules. That the first one is that you always capitalize the genus name, but you always use the lowercase for species. So you never capitalize the species. Secondly, you always italicize these names if you are typing because we consider them proper, right? Or you underline them if handwritten. So again, Homo sapiens or humans, we would need to make sure we write like this. We can't say Homo sapiens with a lowercase h. That would be wrong. We can't say Homo sapiens with a capital S. That would be wrong. We have to write it like this. Sometimes we do abbreviate these things, right? We might say just like H sapiens. Probably the most well-known abbreviated organism is called E. coli, which is the type of bacteria we'll talk about later on. But you always have to follow these rules. Make sure that you underline them and make sure that you capitalize the genus but keep the species lowercase. Now again, Linnaeus was working well before Darwin's time, which means that he did not have a strong understanding of genetics, inheritance, or evolution. So today we talk about sort of a different area. It's still taxonomy, but we call it phylogeny, which is to look at evolutionary relationships and evolutionary history of organisms. And so today we use this to form trees. A lot of times we call these things cladograms. We're not going to get into these in depth. If we had still been in school, we would have done a little more with this. But this is just a way to kind of chart out how closely related certain organisms are to one another. Now, Linnaeus, I like this little chart here. It's getting a little old and dated, but it kind of breaks down how the classification system has evolved over the couple hundred years that it's existed. So, when Linnaeus started out in the mid-1700s, he had two kingdoms, the plants and the animals, right? And then in the late 1800s, they expanded the Linnaean system to include three kingdoms because they discovered microorganisms, right? So they had the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and then the protists, the single-celled organisms. Now then fast forward quite a bit in the 1950s, they realized a couple different things. One, a lot of the things that scientists thought were plants were actually not plants at all. They were fungi. And so they separated the plant kingdom into two different things, plants and fungi, left the animal kingdom alone. But then they also, with much advanced, technology, were able to realize that not all microorganisms are the same either. And so we had the protists, who are eukaryotic, and then the monorins, which are prokaryotic. And then most recently, in the 1990s, which I know is getting old now, they also have discovered that there are different types of monorins. So even the prokaryotic cells are now broken down into two different kingdoms. And so today we have 6 kingdoms in the classification system that we use. Now the kingdoms, very quickly, kind of nutshell version here, include the eubacteria or true bacteria, which are unicellular prokaryotes. Then we also have the archaea, or the archaebacteria, is our second kingdom. And the archaebacteria are prokaryotes that are called extremophiles. They're only found in extreme environments. These, in fact, this picture up here would be our extremophiles. They might be found like at extreme pH in your stomach, or at extreme temperatures in a volcanic vent or something like that. Then we got the protists. They're pictured up here in the upper left. The protists are unicellular eukaryotic organisms. So this picture up here is a paramecium, would be an example of a protist. The fungi are also eukaryotic. They can be unicellular or multicellular, as I'm sure you know, like with this picture of mushrooms. But what scientists realize that are different about these guys when compared to plants are that they are heterotrophic. So fungi are not autotrophic. They can't do anything like photosynthesis, but they have to feed off of organic matter, and they do that by kind of breaking down matter in the soil usually. Then you got the plants, right? The plant kingdom, like this fern right here, are eukaryotic, multicellular, and photosynthetic, or autotrophic. And then the animal kingdom, of course, like us, are eukaryotic, multicellular, heterotrophs. Now, molecular technology, so basically an understanding of DNA, has allowed us in, again, the 1990s, so it's been a while, to expand even beyond kingdoms. So today, in the modern Linnaean system, right, we actually have domains, which are larger than the kingdom level. And there are 3 domains. We've got the eukarya, or eukaryotes. Again, just to remind you from first semester, these are organisms with nuclei in their cells. And the eukarya would include 4 of our kingdoms: the protists, the fungi, the plants, and the animals. Second domain is referred to as the bacteria. These are your more common prokaryotes. And essentially that is the kingdom eubacteria. And then the third domain is called archaea. And again, these are the extremophiles, or the extreme prokaryotes. So this is essentially the kingdom archaebacteria. So in today's modern Linnaean system, right, we have 7 different taxa. From largest to smallest, that would be domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And there's a lot of different ways to remember this, but I was taught in high school, and I still remember to this day, to remember, did King Philip cry out for goodness sakes? So here's King Philip. Did King Philip cry out for goodness sakes? And that will give you the first letters of these things, so you can always remember, what's bigger or smaller than what. So domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Did King Philip cry out for goodness sakes? Now, the last thing I put together in these notes was a little slide about classes found in Animalia. Obviously, we've talked already about kind of human evolution and what a human is, and we're going to very shortly go into the other types of organisms, but I didn't want to ignore the different classes of animals. So again, this is, you've got, domain, kingdom, phylum, and then class. And these are sort of categorizations that I think most of us know about in more common speech, but giving you the actual classes that these are. So the reptilia, right, the reptiles. Reptilia are cold-blooded. I like to think of these as dry organisms. They look more dry, right, and scaled. These include snakes, lizards, gators, crocodiles, tortoises. Marvin and Stevie are turtles in the lab. The amphibia, very closely related to the reptiles, but different, right? These are cold-blooded. I think of these more as damp, right? Their skin has to maintain moisture at all times, so they're always found near creeks and things like that. So these would be the frogs, the toads, little geckos, right? Salamanders, newts, that sort of thing. Then we've got our fish, our underwater friends. Osteichthyes are the bony fishes, which I can't remember if this has come up this year or not, but fishes is the appropriate plural in science. I think the English language says you can say fish or fishes, but I had a professor at U of L who was a fish specialist, an ichthyologist, and he always talked about how it got on his nerves because people didn't use the appropriate fishes when they talked about them. So osteichthyes are the bony fishes. These, are cold-blooded. They live underwater. They process oxygen with gills. And this is the majority of fish, right, or underwater species that you would find. Then you have the chondrichthyes. Chondra referring to cartilage, the cartilaginous fish or fishes. These are also cold-blooded. These also, quote-unquote, breathe with gills. But these are the sharks and rays. Right, so the sharks and rays are unique because they have a cartilage skeleton versus a bony skeleton. What this does is allows them to become massive, right? They can be really big, have a really large skeleton, and still, since it's cartilage, it's light enough that it's buoyant and can float through the water. Then you got aves or the avians, which are the birds, like this cool toucan here. They are warm-blooded, a lot more like us, right? Two-legged and winged, have a beak, those sort of things. And then the mammals, right? This is where we would fall, right? So warm-blooded, generally have 4 limbs, have some type of fur on their body, which you do too, right? Lungs for breathing the air. And then, this includes all kinds of things. So humans and lions and bears and other apes and dolphins and whales and bats and things like that. So, and then I put this on here at the last minute too. Just don't forget about insects and arachnids. These are also different classes. So the insect group would be a different class. The arachnida or the spiders and scorpions would be a group as well. So we've talked way too much about this stuff. Let's move on and look at the different types of organisms together next.